A group of 49 Afrikaner refugees have arrived at the international airport just outside Washington, D.C. to a warm welcome from senior officials of the U.S. Department of State and Homeland Security. The group of white South Africans departed Johannesburg overnight and arrived in the United States via Dakar, Senegal. They are the first beneficiaries of U.S. refugee status after President Donald Trump signed an executive order in February seeking to address so-called egregious actions of the Republic of South Africa. Now, the group appeared to be largely made up of young families with a number of children who were all smiles when they were welcomed by officials from the U.S. government.
To the United States of America. It is such an honor for us to receive you here today. This is the land of the free, and we know that all of you have faced. I know that this is going to be, any adjustment in life, any change takes a while to get used to. But I want you all to know that you are really welcome here and that we respect what you have had to deal with these last few years. We respect the long tradition of your people and what you have accomplished over the years. And I am sure that you will be successful. It's, as you know, a lot of you, I think, are farmers, right? When you have quality seeds, you can put them in foreign soil and they will blossom, they will bloom. And we are excited to welcome you here.
Now, for more, we speak with our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's monitoring events from New York. Sherwin, always good to have you with us. So they've arrived in the United States. They've been welcomed by senior officials, as we saw a bit earlier on. What happens now?
Well, this is very much the beginning of a process in their new life and journey, essentially, Mfundo, in the United States. We do understand that this group of, the first group of 49 people that have now arrived at Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C., will now be processed in the nation's capital and then, we believe, be dispersed around the country. They will not all be going to the same space or the same place. We understand that a number of states, 50 in total in the United States, a portion of those states have indicated a willingness to receive these Afrikaner white refugees into the country and help them now assimilate into the United States. We understand, according to the New York Times, that the administration is preparing to help them find temporary and then long-term accommodations, right? Housing is going to be very important. And then the basics, like your furnishings for your home, the essential household items, cleaning supplies, groceries, weather-appropriate clothing, right? I mean, they're coming here during the summer months, but come later this year, your Octobers, Novembers, Decembers, the winter months will then be providing a different kind of perspective, particularly if you're in some of the coldest places like Montana or Michigan, up in the Great Lakes bordering Canada up north. Things like appropriate clothing, diapers, formula, hygiene products, and of course, prepaid phones. But this was some more information provided by the Deputy Secretary of State, Christopher Landau, at that welcoming ceremony a few moments ago. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Secretary of Homeland Security and I just met with this first flight of South African refugees to arrive in our country. Pursuant to the President's executive order about certain egregious actions in South Africa. The President made it clear that Afrikaners in South Africa who are the victims of unjust racial discrimination would be welcome to come to the United States, and he's now delivering on that promise. The Deputy Secretary and I just spoke to some of the folks who arrived on this flight, and they tell quite harrowing stories of the violence that they faced in South Africa that was not redressed by the authorities, by the unjust application of the law. The United States, as we were proud to say, stands for equal justice under law and the fair and impartial application of the law. And again, this is a group that has not experienced that and has, to the contrary, experienced violence and really fear for their lives in South Africa. They were really subject to very serious, egregious and targeted threats. And we wish them well in their journey of the United States.
And of course, Mfundo, those comments there by the Deputy Secretary of State are disputed, certainly, by South African authorities, and we can certainly debate that further. But the broader context here is the expedited nature at which and with which the Trump administration has accommodated these white Afrikaner refugees from South Africa. The broader context here is that on January 20th, the day Donald Trump took his oath of office to return to the White House, he signed an executive order essentially suspending the U.S. refugee program in its entirety. So the only refugees coming into the United States right now, despite some being pre-approved from most horrific war-torn places around the world, they are now in limbo awaiting the suspension of this refugee program to be lifted. But essentially the only refugees coming into the United States are these white Afrikaner South Africans. And that really speaks to how this has become a priority for the Trump administration, given the broad needs of refugees around the world.
Now, Sherwin, the Deputy Secretary of State was also asked a question about the specific threats that these Afrikaners face in South Africa. What was his response to some of those questions?
Well, this is what he said, right? I made some notes here. He said that they faced threats of expropriation of their land. So some of the similar allegations you've heard from the highest echelons of the U.S. administration, including President Donald Trump. He says there were threats of expropriation of their land without compensation. Of course, we know that that is not true, based also on that they faced direct threats of violence, that many of the people they spoke to had experienced threatening invasions of their homes, their farms, and a real lack of interest from the government in doing anything about the situation. This is now quoting Christopher Landau, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. He also referred to some politicians singing "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," and that they had people there living under a shadow of violence and terror for some time now. Now, juxtapose what the statement said on Friday, issued as we learned about this charter plane that was going to take these 49 South Africans to the United States late last week. And I'm just quoting from their statement here, Mfundo. It is most regrettable that it appears that the resettlement of South Africans to the United States under the guise of being refugees is entirely politically motivated and designed to question South Africa's constitutional democracy. We reiterate that allegations of discrimination are unfounded. And of course, just look at my social media thread. I mean, this is a debate that continues today.
Certainly, but there's also another debate that continues, Sherwin, around what we heard from the Deputy Secretary when he spoke about the 49 being generally farmers. Now, farmers, just the term, is quite general in its sense, because you can either be a farm owner or you can be a farm worker or farm laborer. And we also heard that they've been carefully vetted and meet the requirements. Do we know if the distinction has been made that these are farmers in the sense of farm owners or farm workers, the 49, or at least the adults among the 49?
One of my sources here, who will not be named, he asked not to be named for fear of persecution, but he's kind of a stakeholder here in the United States that understands these processes. And he said despite their efforts to understand how this process of vetting was going to happen, they had not received any information from the Departments of Homeland Security or the Department of State that has been tasked by Trump's executive order to manage this process of prioritization and resettlement of white Afrikaners. And he said he could not understand how the adjudication and criteria, or essentially how the criteria was applied here, or how these individuals were vetted, particularly in the 3 months since the executive order was signed. We are now having the first arrivals in the United States. Historically speaking and traditionally understanding the process, a refugee resettlement process is a very slow-moving train. It takes somewhat, more than 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, up to 3 years before therefore, since the beginning of the process, still people arrive here. And so what you've seen here is an expedited process. One doesn't understand exactly what the criteria was here. You saw very young families arriving here.
Yeah.
One can't imagine that young people of that nature would be farm owners per se. Maybe their parents owned farms, but there were the majority of the people there were young kids, young families moving here. And so they were certainly the preferred choice of the U.S. administration. But to this day, we are unable to report on the criteria that was used in terms of, procuring these first 49.
Hopefully in the days to come it will become more clearer as to what criteria was used now when vetting. But President Trump was also asked to weigh in on this matter earlier and again made allegations of land confiscation and a genocide against white farmers. And despite efforts from the South African government to dispel these gross misrepresentations, the narrative certainly Sherwin out of the White House does not appear to have shifted at all.
And understand that there has now been direct engagement, whether you're talking about Zane Dangle, the Director General in the Department of International Relations. He was in the United States in late March in his capacity as the G20 Sherpa for South Africa. His interlocutors included the G20 Sherpa for the United States, to which South Africa will hand over the presidency of the G20 come the end of November this year. There's been that engagement. You also heard President Ramaphosa talk alongside Volodymyr Zelensky at the Union Buildings in April that he had had a direct conversation with President Trump where these issues, many of them, including this notion of a white genocide in South Africa, was dispelled by the South African president. And then, of course, you had Alvin Botha speaking with the very Christopher Landau, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, on Friday in terms of sort of counterpointing, the notion of the claims that are made in terms of justifying the resettlement of these so-called white Afrikaner refugees to the United States. So that engagement is happening, that rebuffing is happening, but the narrative coming out of the government institutions here in the United States, including the White House and the State Department, does not seem to have wavered from the initial, the premise for that executive order that was signed by President Trump in February. So it begs the question then, right? If Donald Trump is now saying that Cyril Ramaphosa is coming to the White House next week, what does that face-to-face mean in terms of the inability of South Africa to move the U.S. needle away from this notion of white genocide and, crimes against humanity, essentially targeting white minorities in South Africa? Will a face-to-face meeting be able to move the needle in that sense and really get these two countries on the same page? This is but one issue. There are also outstanding issues as it relates to trade with the United States. Yeah. There are some foreign policy positions that the two countries differ around. And so there are many issues that need to be addressed here. And one imagines the golf handicap and whose golf swing is better might be part of those conversations, Mfuna.
Most certainly. But I suppose the face-to-face now is probably the one that might decide if actually the needle does move any further. Sherwin, thank you very much for joining us. That is SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease speaking to us there from New York.